Bonjour tout le monde. Voilà, on peut commencer maintenant. Je passe en anglais juste pour quelques secondes. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raya Kalinova. I am the Executive Vice President and CEO of the European Jewish Congress, and I welcome you all, women and men, of course, to our first webinar of the spring. And it is not by chance that we chose this date of the 8th of March to do it during the Day of Women. And just to remind you that the webinar will be in French and that you can choose on the button of your Zoom tab to listen it in English if you prefer by selecting the English channel. Pour les francophones, le Zoom est par défaut en français. Alors
so, for the French-speaking people, the Zoom is by default in French, so you don't have to do anything. I would like to thank our speakers of today, who are three fascinating and very committed women, and they will be introduced to you in details in a few seconds by our moderator. As you know, the EJC is not at all sexist or macho organization. My role, my position within the organization is a concrete evidence of that. And as we are celebrating today the International Women's Day, I would like to convey to you the best wishes of our chairperson, Moshe Kantor, who's going to follow this conference with a lot of interest. I would now like to give the floor to our moderator, Ariella Woitchik, who is the Director of European Affairs within AGC, and who is also at the head of the European Jewish Fund. Ariella, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Raya, for this introduction. First, good afternoon and welcome to the conference organized by the European Jewish Congress, which on this International Women's Day will focus on the points of intersection between anti-Semitism and sexism. I'm very pleased to moderate this debate, which may seem unexpected to some, in the company of three remarkable women whom I have the pleasure of introducing to you in a moment. Of course, anti-Semitism does not stop where sexism starts. Hatred is made of both phenomena, and we have to take on board those two problems. We're going to talk to you about this intersection, these meeting points with three remarkable women. Let us start with Ilana Cicurel. Since 2020, she's a member of the Renaissance list at the European Parliament. She's also a member of the executive board of République En Marche. She's in charge of issues related to education, higher education and research. Her attachment to education has also led her to found the citizens collective Je m'engage pour l'école, which aims at transforming the education system, fighting against inequalities in destiny, and better prepare students for the challenges of tomorrow. She's very much attached to democracy. She's also a member of the Education and Culture Committee, as well as Employment and Social Affairs. She's also a member of the Working Group on Antisemitism at the level of the European Parliament. We would like to thank you for having accepted this invitation today. Because of your pathway, you're going to bring a lot of expertise regarding the points of intersection between anti-Semitism and sexism, and also the way in which we have to fight against those two forms of discrimination. We also have with us Delphine Horvilleur. After having worked as a journalist with the editorial staff of France Télévisions, Delphine studied for 5 years at the Rabbinical Seminary of Hebrew Union College in New York. Ordained a rabbi in 2008, she then became one of the rabbis at the Mouvement Juif Libéral de France in Paris, and one of the first women to hold this position. In 2009, she took over as head of Detwani magazine, a moment of dialogue and bringing together 300 people each month in Paris. She's also one of the founding members of CEREM, the Council of French-Speaking Liberal Rabbis. She's also the author of numerous books, the latest of which, Vivre avec nos morts, Living with Our Dead, was recently published by Grasset. Through an exchange with the philosopher Claire Marin and many stories about personalities or anonymous people, Delphine reminds us in this book to what extent life and death are silent at every moment, and to what extent the pandemic has left us many ghosts. So many times we have not always had the opportunity to say goodbye to our beloved ones, and we would have liked to do so. A book to be discovered without delay. Dear Delphine, we are very happy to have you as our guest on this special day, because you are for many women, and dare I say for many men, a model and a source of inspiration. And finally, Viviane Teitelbaum. She's a Belgian politician, member of the Parliament of the Brussels Capital Region since 2004, where she currently sits on several committees, including the one on equality and women's rights. Viviane implemented the first gender-sensitive budget at the municipal level in Belgium during her mandate as alderman between 2020 and 2018. She's currently president of the Feminist Observatory on Violence Against Women, which she co-funded. She was president of the European Women's Lobby from 2012 to 2016 and president of the Council of French-Speaking Women of Belgium. As you will have understood, Viviane is a committed and recognized feminist. But this is not her only fight. Viviane also fights against anti-Semitism and for the preservation of the memory of the Shoah. She was president of the Coordinating Committee of Jewish Organizations in Belgium from 1998 to 2001. She's also an author, and she has published 10 books and has collaborated in various collective works. The two struggles in Viviane's life make her a choice speaker for this conference. She will attempt to highlight the similarities that can exist between these two plagues, and in particular, the very pernicious form that this expression of hatred takes when anti-Semitism and sexism target the same person. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ilana. Ilana, we would like you to say a few words about your pathway, and I would like your analysis as a member of politics regarding those two types of hatred, especially in a framework of identitarian closure. We say that only a woman can fight against sexism, or a non-Semitic person can combat other types of stereotypes. I would like you to tell us what we could do to make sure that society as such is really involved in this fight and not only the victims of that fight. Thank you very much. Thank you all to be with us. I'm very pleased to have Viviane with us, as well as Delphine. I would like to thank you for having stressed this danger which we are all facing today. The fact that there is no sense of universality in front of those types of discrimination. Today, France, but also other large democracies, we are facing a kind of divide in our societies. Jérôme Fourquet, who's a sociologist and philosopher, explained to us, based on figures, explained that in our country there is a trend towards fragmentation. We are just adding up lobbies or groups of interest, and we all fight one against the other. We are not universal, we're not together. Regarding anti-racism, we are really we have to reaffirm, to restate that anti-Semitism and sexism have to be put in that broader meaning of universality, equality between all men, equality between people, which is at the very basis of the Torah. And here, of course, I'm referring to what Delphine is going to tell us later. But why do we have a man and a woman as a couple, a founding couple of humanity? There is no notion of superiority there. It's equality between both. In some countries, equality between men and women took more time to express itself than in Europe. We had to wait for the end of the 60s to put an end to separate class rooms or schools for boys and girls, for instance. We are, the three of us, we are Jewish, we are women, but we should not consider those struggles as personal struggles. No, we have to put that in a very wider, larger framework. So we have to promote this notion of universality. Anti-Semitism is something which is unfair. It's something that we have to redress, to repair. We should also pay attention to this trend coming from the United States. As you said, Ariella, if we want to be to protect people, if you want to fight racism, you have to be black or things of the kind. I'm going to give you an example. Uriah Boutelja wrote, "No magister will oblige me to say something for white women. I'm belonging to my race, to my country, to my people." So first, we have to restate the universality of our fight, of our struggle. It might seem obvious, but it's not the case. And second, we have to restate this reality in America, and we have to in Europe, we have to fight that trend. Victims also are in societies which are facing a crisis. We have all the elements in our hands to make headway, to make progress. And this is what I would like to say to end this first reaction. Anti-Semitism is not only the business of Jewish people. No. Delphine, in your book, you say that if Jewish people did not exist, anti-Semitic people would have invented them. We are always trying to find a scapegoat because people don't like themselves anymore, so they try to find scapegoats. So all our battles, our fights should be rooted into a larger, a wider fight based on universality. Thank you very much, Ilana. Indeed, as you said, it is very important to involve society. When we say you have to be black to understand racism, you have to be Jewish to understand anti-Semitism, the others might have the feeling that it's not their fight and that they are not involved, which is not the case. Let me now turn to Delphine. As a woman, as a Jewish woman, of course, your experience was not easy within the Jewish community. There are some obstacles, and of course, we have to talk about that. In your experience, Delphine, have you been a victim of anti-Semitism and sexism? And if the answer is yes, was it at the same time? And how do you explain that they feed one another?
D'abord, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Je suis ravie.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you together with Ilana and Viviane. You know that these issues are really dear to my heart because indeed I have been there, and then I wrote a lot also on these issues in my various books on gender bias, but also on anti-Semitism. So, well, yes, the answer is yes. I'm sure that we will come back on this later. While I was studying to become a rabbi, I have been the victim of attacks, anti-Semitic attacks, as it happens, unfortunately, to many people, but also gender-based violence. I remember that I have received letters full of hatred and really insults as well, gender-based insults. And sometimes, and it was even more surprising, those criticisms would come from women who would deem that it was not the place for a woman. And so, you know, they had in mind a clear-cut division of everyone's roles. So it is a way to show that sexism is not always a women's fight. Sometimes it stems from women as well. So I think that we should all together address this phenomenon. I think that this is a stain. This is a stain on our mankind. This is really the impossibility for us to think in terms of universality. You know, when you raise the issue of the role of a woman, you automatically have to address the role of others as well, irrespective of the phase of others. It could be based on religion, it could be based on the place where you live, for instance. So I now would like really to put my hat as a rabbi. Of course, today is a symbol. We are on the 8th of March, the International Women's Day. But you know that the 8th of March very often coincides, I don't know whether it's just by chance, but it is always a coincidence with a Jewish celebration. And I think that there is the Purim, and Purim is really a symbolic day. So Purim is a Megillah that you will read. The hero is a woman, and the story starts with a story of sexism. The king is married to a woman, and she has to introduce herself. According to the legend, she had to introduce herself naked. So Nashti is actually the symbol for the Me Too. She was fighting against the culture of rape because she refused, and she will not become a queen. So there is this reflection because men had the power. Most of them are surrounded by eunuch, and this is not by chance. So there was this debate already back then. You know, if you do not control women, it will be chaotic. You have to keep a grip on women. So at that time, against this backdrop, there was a kind of threat, there was a kind of danger perceived there. And at that time, you had a woman who was going to take the power, Esther, and she became a hero. Now, officially, this story was not a story about fighting sexism, not at all. She was there really to fight another threat. So you clearly see in the story of Esther that rabbis came up very quickly and they established a link between sexism and anti-Semitism, because it was actually the same threat appearing in this kingdom. So I wrote a lot on this issue. In history, of course, the Jews have always been blamed. And, when you hear that the Jews really like power, money, you can hear that all of these words relate to traditional misogyny in a way. Because actually, what people blame to women and Jewish people are to be agent of porosity, to be a little bit like us, but not really like us, a little bit ourselves and a little bit the others. So, as Ilana said, this is very typical, and rabbis know this very well. In times of crises, there is always a threat, a perception of threat upon our identities, our borders, how we are defining ourselves as being pure, not contaminated by others. Now, of course, we have this pandemic, and of course, we do not want to be contaminated. We can hear now this narrative, but of course, we really have to be careful with this obsession of purity, the non-contamination. Of course, this is the narrative which is used by fundamentalists, by religious fundamentalists, by all political extremists, this obsession of purity and non-contamination. And it has always something to do with sexism. And it has always something to do with the hatred of the gays or the Jews, all those who are perceived as maybe creating some trouble in our society. So this is precisely where we stand today. So today, more than ever, we really have to take into account both phenomena at the same time. So, of course, we speak about these points of intersection. What does this mean? Of course, both fights are really joint fight, but we have to be very careful with that. And I will end this first intervention on this. I have the feeling that, I was born in the 70s. At that time, we had a very strong perception of what the fight against sexism was. And then, all of a sudden, there's been a kind of rupture. And it was harmful, and it has something to do with what Ilana said. So we are now a little bit in a kind of selective empathy. You have to choose some people, and you have to turn against others. So this is this selective empathy. But I think that we have to adopt a universal approach. So that's really the key. We should be able to use a proper narrative that will allow us to reach this universality. Thank you. Thank you very much for establishing a bridge between the Bible and our times. We can really feel it on a daily basis. It is always important to recall the specificities of the various forms of hatred. They are not the same. These forms are not the same. We really have to work all together on these forms. It is important to understand the differences between the various types of hatred. Thank you very much. I now would like to give the floor to Viviane. Viviane, could you please share a little bit your experience? Because you have waged both wars. In a way, you are very active in feminist movements. And so I really wanted to hear from you. according to you, what is the take of the feminist movement of anti-Semitism? We know that racism is very often present in these discussions, and sometimes there are blind spots. When, for instance, a woman has been the victim of anti-Semitism. So I would like to give you the floor. Thank you very much indeed, Ariella, and many thanks for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here together with Delphine, Ilana, and you, Ariella. So yes, it is true. Ever since I started my political career, and ever since I joined feminist movements, I have faced these attacks. I have been insulted. It was sexist, gender-based violence. I received death threat as well. I always lodged a complaint because I think that it's the right thing to do. And it is true that there are points of interaction. Sometimes when I speak of anti-Semitism, I receive, answers related to anti-Semitism. Sometimes, when I carry out a campaign, I can hear very unpleasant remarks. As a woman on social networks, obviously, as soon as you start a fight on something, you hear very rude words, and I'm not even going to repeat those words here because they are really too impolite, too rude, but it can become very violent sometimes. So when you are a Jewish woman, feminist, when you are active, of course, you have maybe this tendency to be put in a category, and you have to face both phenomena. Sometimes you can be disqualified. As I am Jewish, but I am supporting also the state of Israel, so I am considered to be Zionist, and so as such, I cannot have a universalist or humanistic approach of society. So there is a kind of disqualification that is taking place. Then it is true to say that because I am Jewish, most of the feminist people are not happy with that, especially in the left. When we think of what we portray, when we speak of standards, the fight against anti-Semitism is not included in the feminist movements. And of course, when I'm addressing these issues, well, people listen to me, but they do not share my views on this. So you can sometimes feel really lonely in those fights. Now, I would like to pick up on what you said, both of you. I think that the problem lies at these points of intersection, not in terms of discrimination, because discrimination is really there. And of course, we have to analyze the links between these phenomena, racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and you name it. We face a plural discrimination. So, of course, there are points of interaction. So today, I think that we see a kind of hierarchy of those fights. And sometimes we tend to give the floor to the allied. For instance, those who take the floor, but simply in order to address one issue. I would like to say that I agree with Ilana. Universality is really fighting this fragmentation within the society. It is important to relate to the pivotal equality values. We really have to take into account cultural diversity. There is this heritage of common and shared values. universalism is also denying inequalities, but we know that we can have an emancipation from these stereotypes. Universality is really key. It's like being in a home arrest, in a way. So what you said, Ariella, there's a notion of how important we need and how important it is to act. We really have to act. And I'm not only talking about feminist movements, but also in politics. When a Jewish woman is insulted, if I am insulted by someone belonging to a right-wing movement, there will be a denunciation, and hopefully so. On the other hand, if, for instance, the person comes from extremist movements or left-wing movements, there will be automatically a kind of protective circle around this person. So this is really an issue, especially when we want to fight together. And we really have to take into account the role of observers, those witnessing these situations. I know that Pastor Niemöller once said, when Nazi came to take the communist, I didn't say anything. I was not a social democrat. I didn't say anything. I was not a trade unionist. And so I think that this is a little bit what we are experiencing nowadays. We see that there is a competition between both fights. And this is not right. I think that this is really an issue, especially if we think about our feminist fights. So this is my first intervention.
L'émotion qui vous accompagne, on sent que c'est un parcours qui est difficile, il faut le dire. D'ailleurs, il y a
Thank you very much. We can feel that this is, of course, a very emotional fight. A survey was conducted regarding anti-Semitism, and it appeared that women victims of anti-Semitism, because they are afraid, are no longer going to be or to show their Jewish nature. They will hide. And we have to say so, because it's very difficult to fight both types of discrimination at the same time. So Viviane referred to this notion of hierarchy, the fact that we put people into boxes, into categories. If it comes from the right, then we react. If it comes from the left, we don't react. You are very much committed regarding education. So what are the tools to fight against those two evils? Education is, of course, very important, but as a politician, what would you propose? How could we mobilize people? How can we be everything but not indifferent to this type of hatred? Well, of course, this is a source of inspiration to me. I listened with a lot of emotion to the testimony of Viviane. I would like to make a comment to what she said. Today, we have the feeling that we are expelled from some fights just because we are a Jewish person related to the state of Israel. But this is something that should not happen, because, you know, our enemies are really perverse. We should be more offensive. If you take the very notion of secularism, for instance, a survey was conducted on young people. And the result was young people do not support a secular state anymore. But first, we have to look at the way in which the questions were raised. Our youth has a certain view on freedom. And secularism is really the foundations of the house, but it took centuries to build. It's something which is marvelous. It's French, but young people just take the advantages of this. Sometimes my daughters have difficulties in understanding this. For instance, the veil. I'm not going to come back to the issue, but of course, freedom of religion means you are free to believe or not to believe. So I'm not going to come back to this debate on the headscarf, but secularism, as I said, is the foundations of the house. And if it disappears, the whole house will fall apart. But our youth today is no longer aware of those foundations. So education is important at many levels. First, elementary education. Jean-Michel Brancard says we have to write, read, but also respect one another. It goes beyond the fact of simply saying, hello, how are you? No, it's much more. This is something I see with my European colleagues. It's surprising, but we all have the same questions. Access to reading, because the text you read is as if were someone else. So it's someone else you have to read, you have to integrate. And this is basic, it's essential. But if you miss that first step of writing, reading, and respect for the other, well, the rest will fall apart. So I repeat, education should be our fight. I would like to tell you that education is more important today. We have the European space for education at a European level, so it's climbing up the ladder in terms of priorities. Education today is, there is really a consensus about education. On a daily basis, I'm fighting for Europe to become an education-based fortress. We want to have all the youth, all the children with us. They all have to be involved. This is something which is on the rise, as I said, but therefore we need more resources. We need to have a research budget. We have to exchange good practices. This is not enough today. We are exchanging things, but it's not enough. So this notion of a European Union based on education is essential. And the chairwoman of the Commission reminded us of the fight against discrimination. In my program, we train couples of citizens two people who go to the different education fields or sectors at university, elementary school, and we educate. So basic knowledge first, then inclusion, because we tend to say that the major problems are problems related to work, finding a job, social problems. I'm also very much involved at the French level in mentorship programs, because to me, mentorship is much more than simply an idea or a program. It's really a model of society. And this is also what we can use to fight anti-Semitism. Delphine and myself have realized that when there is a crisis, anti-Semitism is on the increase. So we have to be present at all levels. We have to fight different things at the same time. Education, to me, has to be seen in a broader sense. Viviane said that anti-Semitism is also today equal to anti-Zionism. So we have to work on a better knowledge of the history of Israel, on prejudices. And this definition of anti-Semitism, which is being developed and adopted by many European countries, include this notion of anti-Zionism. Of course, we can criticize the policies decided by the State of Israel, but this is true for any country. But we are still questioning the legitimacy of that country. When you are in international meetings, you realize that all of a sudden, 70% of the resolutions are related to the State of Israel. So this is something we have to try to better understand and explain to people. Because a lot of people today are not paying attention or are ignorant. And our job is to educate everyone, the youth, but also everyone, all our citizens. We have to fight against ignorance, which is very often the basis of hatred and prejudice. Thank you very much. The youth is our future. If we don't plant the seeds today, we will not have the crops that we expect in 20 years. A survey was conducted regarding anti-Semitism, and it's true that people aged less than 30 very often did not know what we're talking about. So it's at that level that we have to be vigilant. So thank you very much for your work, Ilana. Delphine, let me go back to you. You still have your hat as a Jewish community. And of course, there are a lot of sexist stereotypes in our own community. We very often have to realize that there aren't enough women wanting to take this leadership role in our community because of all the obstacles. So my question is, how could we raise the awareness of the community to counter these stereotypes, and how can we encourage young women, young girls, so that they could take leadership positions, become a rabbi, or be there at high levels, at power levels? I would like to come back to what Ilana just said. Of course, when we come back to the very foundations of education, I would like to add something. I often have to take the floor in the English-speaking world. There are a lot of transatlantic misunderstandings regarding secularism or problems regarding multiculturalism. What happened on the other side of the Atlantic? Could it happen in our countries? Question mark. But the system, our system in France, our society, makes it possible for everyone to speak in your own name. So you can really express yourself. So sentences that are very common in the United States. For instance, as a Jewish person, I think that. As a Black person, I think that. As a member of the LGBT community, I do think that. Well, this way of thinking is very common, as I said, on the other side of the Atlantic, but not in Europe, not in France. In France, we tend not to start a sentence by stating who you are. When I start a sentence, I would like to say, well, as a woman living in Paris, adoring to eat sushis, not fond of sports and things of the kind. So what I mean is that our identity is multidimensional. And we have, of course, the we as a nation, the we as Europeans, but not a we, W-E, as members of different groups. And that's what Ilana said earlier. So she referred to the spokesperson of the indigenous of the Republic, and she says we and never I. So she always says we because she's a member of a community with its own expectations and requests. So we have to give the floor to the other. And I also have this sentence of Linda Sarsour, who's the leader of the women's movement in the United States at the very beginning, saying that you could not be a Zionist and feminist at the same time. So according to her, feminism could include the fight of all women, but not the women, the Jewish women living in Israel. And then we also had this idea, according to which when people say that they are anti-Zionist, you don't know what it means. I usually stop the discussion when someone tells me I am anti-Zionist. Then I ask, okay, what do you mean by that? And very often, people are not able to explain to you what they mean by that. They just question the legitimacy of the state to exist, because you don't have to invent a word to say that you are against something. So there is, right at the very beginning, a misunderstanding. So this is something that we all have to pay attention to. Our identities are complex, subtle, and at that level, of course, education plays a major role, but also parents and religious leaders, which brings me to your question. I came back to France 12 years ago. I was a third rabbi woman in France at that time, but this was still perceived as something being completely strange. Now, of course, things have changed a little, but at the time when I said that I was a rabbi and a woman, well, people were a bit looking at me in a strange way. It was something that was not normal, that was strange. And people were smiling or laughing at me. It was not always easy to fight against such behavior, such mockery. It's very difficult for a woman to express her identity, and women are more sensitive to that problem. It's very difficult to explain, but very often women are really questioning, is it legitimate for me to be there? Maybe there is someone who could replace me, and this is something women have problems with, and this is an obstacle for them to access a leadership role. Maybe it was the case for Viviane or Ilana, but very often I am a member of a panel in the Jewish community and I am the only woman. And when I ask the organizers, why didn't you invite other women? Sometimes they say, well, we didn't think about that, or they tell me we tried. But many women said or answered, I'm not legitimate. So this is something we have to pay attention to at all levels, including the families and also our religious or community based institutions. What can we do to encourage women to take the floor? Therefore, they have to have access to knowledge. This is true in all structures, but it's more true in our Jewish tradition. If you don't have access to knowledge, you don't have access to power, because the source of power is knowledge.
Et heureusement qu'il y a des formules différentes, et c'est la grande chance.
So hopefully there are many forms, and we have different viewpoints and different religious approaches. But I think that nowadays we really need to focus on the access of women to knowledge. And there is a key here. It is about cultural changes. First, you need a political decision at the top. Decisions must be made in education. So, of course, I am just sharing here my example. I have been a rabbi for the last 12 years now. So it means that there is a generation of children out there who have only known a woman rabbi. When I am organizing a service, a service at the synagogue, well, I'm there. And so you have there a generation of children who have only seen a woman rabbi. So, you know, sometimes boys come and see me and they say to me, you know, oh, that's a pity. I wish I could have become a rabbi, but I see now that it's a woman. You see, very funny situations. So now we see that for the little girls and young girls, they see now that it's possible for a woman to become a rabbi. Absolutely. Thank you very much. We have really to be an inspiration. So we are little by little reaching the end of our webinar, but I would like to give you the floor, Viviane. I also would like to ask you, throughout your career, do you think that being a woman and being Jewish was considered to be a strength or a disadvantage? Well, I believe that my multifaceted personality is really a strength. I am really fighting against the identity house arrest, so to say. I am fighting against all types of gender-based religious violences, and I regret, you know, what I see sometimes. There is an ideological paradigm here leading to women being opposed to women simply because of the color of their skin, for instance, based on their feeling of belonging to a movement, a religion, or simply because of the ideas they stand up for. Of course, I think that we really need to defend universalism, and this is really our weapon, so to say. You know, you can really work with individuals, with persons, not necessarily with communities. This is something we tend to forget. And I have in mind here the left, you know, they are always using the same approach to communities. And really this is, this has a deleterious effect on women. Sometimes women try to move away from these categories. Before we would speak of racism and anti-Semitism, well, I know that in Brussels, in the parliament in Brussels, We've seen already conferences addressing racism, but I think that we need to go one step further. Let's not forget that we had concentration camps in Europe. We hear now Israel becomes a kind of insult. So this is unacceptable. I have presented legal text on this issue. They haven't been reviewed yet, but simply uttering the word Israel sounds like an insult to some people and, to some groups in the parliament. So I believe that, as Ilana said, we need to work on education, on laws as well. We are politicians, so that's also one of the reasons why we're here. Of course, there are points of intersection, and maybe we need to think of the Anglo-Saxon model. We really need to do away with this hierarchy. You recalled the fight of Lindar Sarsour. Zionists are excluded from the feminist fight, and I have experienced this. But these people are also attacking persons like Ilana Cicurel, for instance. She is under a fatwa. Lindar Sarsour, in a tweet about her, said, well, I wish I would have been able to extract her vagina because she doesn't deserve it. So, of course, we need to fight this. Universalism, humanism are probably positive avenues for us that we should follow. Thank you very much indeed, Viviane. And we see that it's very difficult to fight racism and the various forms of anti-Semitism nowadays. We understand that this is a challenge, and your fight is not an easy fight. Thank you very much. Ilana, I now would like to turn to you and to give you the floor, maybe to wrap up this webinar. Well, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. Of course, we have said that it is about universality, but of course, we shouldn't be ashamed of intervening, in some specific cases. This is not our point. Of course, women will be maybe more sensitive on some issues. Of course, some of us will recall that, there were not many people at the times of the attacks in Toulouse. Maybe, you had there a handful of Jewish people only. So, of course, not everything is a bed of roses, absolutely not. I think that these fights need to be universal. We need to wage those fights for everyone. I am in favor of parity. I'm very happy to see that now progress are made at the level of the European Parliament when it comes down to disclosing the wage gaps, for instance, between men and women. I can see that mentalities are changing, including in my Renaissance group. So, progress is made, which is nice. We share those fights, and we say, well, this is everyone's fight. This is everybody's fight. This holds true for the fights. It means that we have a very enriching situation. Of course, I'm not saying here that we should give up who we are. Absolutely not, because we have our own rich experiences. But I think that we have to see how this can be translated. How is it possible to translate Hebrew into Greek? For instance, to reach a joint and common universal language. We have a very good example with Simone Weil, who escaped the Shoah, but then she gave a helping hand to Germany. She fought also to defend women's rights. And she said, well, let's not dwell on the past and let's turn to the future. And of course, you have this memory task, the duty of memory. The idea is really to understand what happened in the past and how it is possible to teach it to the future generations so that it does not happen again. But, we know that evil is in every human being. So Simone Weil is a wonderful example, an inspirational example, and I really would like maybe to end on this note. Thank you so much for your invitation. Well, thank you very much. We know that we have had wonderful women with us today. I now would like to give the floor to Delphine. Thank you very much for recalling Simone Weil. I am very happy that we have been able to have this discussion on the 8th of March. I am a little bit upset when I hear people talking of the International Women's Day. It is a little bit suspicious, as if you had only one woman as a being. It is also another way of putting women into boxes. And we do the same thing with Jews. So we are no longer able to perceive that, there is a pluralism here. There are sometimes many voices speaking within the same person. I do not like this monolithic approach. I think that we really need to listen to the outsider world. The threat is there, and I think that we need to stick to this translation narrative, as Ilana has just said. Of course, this is really dear to the Jewish tradition. Those translations are really key. When I hear the ongoing speeches, this is really topical, who can translate who, who do you have to be able to translate someone else? There is a philosophical and spiritual debate here. We should be able to have those translations because we are not the other. We do not have the same story. There is a kind of journey between my experience and the other's experiences. So it is about this wisdom. Binar in Hebrew is the intersection, so to say, as we have in French, the capacity to read between the lines. This is about the wisdom. We do live in between two worlds, in between two languages, the one inside of us and the one outside of us. And I'm very happy that we have interpreters. I know that it has not been easy, but I would like to pay tribute to our interpreters because this is also a wonderful task. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our interpreters because today's debate was not easy. I would like to end on a Tolstoy quote, "The fate of the world is in our hands." So I really would like to pay tribute to all women, those who are fighting so hard on a daily basis. Thank you so much once again for being with us today and for highlighting this International Women's Day. And I am sure that this debate has been extremely enriching and inspirational. Take care, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye-bye.